Aloha everyone, and welcome to another episode of Sincerely Alana. On today's episode, we are going to be learning the difference between white supremacy, white fragility, and white privilege, as well as talking about how to confront one's own racism and how to be an ally. First, let's talk about white supremacy. So white supremacy is the term that race scholars use to describe a socio-political economic system of domination based on racial categories that benefits those defined or perceived as being white. White supremacy, I know it's a term that's being used a lot in today's current political environment, and that's because they're white supremacists, making it very known where they stand and waving around the Confederate flag, waving Nazi flags. And it's really scary because white supremacists just take it to a whole nother level of really believing that they are better than anyone else, better than any other race. Like I mentioned in last week's video, this is extremely damaging and it's wrong. This is racism. White supremacists are racist because they truly do believe in that hierarchy of races, one race being better than all other races, and the rest of them fall in line in a hierarchical system. White privilege is the inherent advantages possessed by a white person based on their race in a society that is characterized by racial inequality and injustice. So what this looks like, this was again previously mentioned briefly in last week's video, but for white privilege, people who are white or can pass as being white often have certain advantages that people of color do not have. One example is equal housing opportunities, and what I recently just saw, which surprised me, was the example of when you buy a house, a lot of people just assume that your family can give you a loan of $50,000 to $100,000, and this is very common for white families, white people who have generations of wealth building that they have had the privilege to obtain. But unfortunately for people of color, that generational wealth building is just not there, and so again, white privilege. Another example of white privilege is getting better grades, being less likely to be suspended in school, also being more likely to be released or let go should a police officer stop that person. The last term that I'm going to talk about today is white fragility. White fragility is the discomfort or defensiveness experienced by a white person when confronted by information about racial inequality and injustice. I've heard some people also refer to this as white guilt, but what makes it more fragility for me, as far as I understand the term, is how defensive people get about it and how quick they are to try to defend their point of view or to try to say that whatever's being presented is not real or doesn't exist. Real quickly, just to review a term from last week, colorblindness. I just want to make it very clear that colorblindness is still a means of maintaining racial inequality. It's just a way of doing so without appearing racist. Ignoring somebody's color, history, and background really does not help, and it makes the situation worse because it continues to give in to these powers into these systems of hierarchy and injustice. So why does white fragility happen? Why are we so quick to get into arguments? Why is the white community so defensive when it comes to talking about race and racism? Well, in short, white people have been trained to ignore and deny or rationalize away the significant costs of racism. It's really sobering to talk about the actual cost of maintaining racism and these systems of injustice, division, and exploitation within our society. Oftentimes, people of color are asked to assimilate into the dominant society, which again is assimilating into white mainstream culture, and this leads to people leaving behind their languages, food, music, game rituals, and other expressions that their genealogy, their parents or grandparents have used. White people, and I'm sure people of color too, because of what's taught in our school system, education system, yeah, white people have a very distorted and inaccurate picture of history and politics because the truth about history has been cleaned up. The truth about racism has been excluded oftentimes, and the contributions of people of color are often left out, while the roles of white people have been cleaned up, modified, and idolized. A lot of people will often say, well, what about poor people? What about poor white people who experience certain types of discrimination, or who also have really rough struggles, or, you know, stuff like this? Well, white people, all people really, are exploited by the ruling class, but the lower class white population often are unable to fight or realize this exploitation because they're taught to scapegoat people of color. So how do we confront our own racism? All people, regardless of color, do have racial bias, and so for white people to confront their racism, I think it's also very important for people of color to confront their own racial bias. So I think the first step in this is to really surround yourselves and start building relationships with people of all colors, all ethnicities, all races, and really try to get to know them and escape any type of racist thought or prejudice that might come into your head. Oftentimes, like I said before in the previous video, prejudice is based off of not even knowing that person, not knowing that culture. It's just based off of some assumption that you develop from hearing something at some point in time. So by surrounding yourself with people of all races and getting to know them well, you start associating all those positive attributes, and they cancel out the ones that you have made for yourself in your head, or that you've heard that have formed these thoughts within your head. People who are in positions of power, especially if you're white, please try to be aware of how you convey certain messages of racism. Maybe not so much even race, but how you convey messages of inequality and unequalness to the people within your environment and within your organization, within your job, within your company, and the people that you are responsible for as, you know, having that higher position of power. It's really important to take the time to recognize, even if you're not in a position of power, your own bias and work at it. There are tons of studies done about teachers and their responses to white students versus students of color, and many teachers have admitted that they're quick to become mad at or judge or scold a child of color before a white person. There's another really interesting article that I'll be sure to post on Sincerely Alana that talks about how damaging it is, and how for white students it's often said that, oh, boys will be boys, or they're kids, they'll grow up, there's nothing to worry about, when the same teacher will often look at young black students or students of color and adultify them, make them feel that they're responsible for their actions at such a young age, when they don't. They're granting that to white children. So it really is damaging, especially if you are someone who's a leader in your community, someone who's a boss, someone who is a teacher, and you have an impact on so many young minds, so many minds around you. So being mindful and trying to address your own racial biases is extremely important. But it's not easy. It's not easy. Nobody wants to admit that they're racist or that they have prejudice towards a group of people. But it's something that needs to be done. It's something that if we don't do, these issues are going to continue to happen, and we are going to see more and more people hurt, psychologically damaged, mentally impaired, or worse, but still very true and relevant, people are going to end up dead. So how do we take anti-racist action? I believe, and there are actually studies that also believe, if we just implemented a realistic program of education, we could get rid of racism within one generation. If our education systems, not just within school, but within churches, community organizations, if we taught racial equality starting at the earliest age onwards, it is extremely possible that racism, or the blunt of racism, could be gone within one generation. And another major step to to implement within our education systems is new courses on the oneness of all humankind. If we stopped teaching that there were different races and there is only one race, and that is the human race, that is a huge step forward in getting rid of racism. Of course, it is important to learn about our cultural differences and that there are different ethnic groups, but instead of describing them as being so different and focusing on the differences, we should also really focus on the similarities. One thing that I have caught myself feeling, and definitely others, is that part of the harm that racism does is that it forces people of color to be very weary and mistrustful of white people. Just like how sexism makes women feel very mistrustful and weary of men. Also, a way that white people justify withdrawing their support, withdrawing their understanding of race and racism is by finding a person of color who represents in their minds the reason why people of color don't really deserve support. So to those of you who might recognize or realize that this is part of your own racial bias or part of your own racism, it's important to realize that not all people are perfect. That includes you, that includes people of color. And so using one person as a scapegoat to be a representative of an entire race is completely wrong, completely unjustified, and you need to realize, like, when is the last time you spoke for a representative for all white people or all people of your race? Well, what can you do to be an ally? Number one is listen to people of color and the actions and programs that they're trying to implement and take. Also realize the risk that they bear in defending their lives and challenging hegemony or the status quo. People of color are always going to be on the front lines. They're always going to be fighting for their freedom, for equality, for equity. And so realizing that their lives are at stake, and if you're a white person, realizing that yours will never be on the line the same way, think about how you can act and support them effectively. Don't automatically jump in and assume that you know what to do or what's going on. Really take the time to learn and ask people around you how you can support and the difference that you can make. Make sure to do your research. There's so many. We are in the age of information right now, and I really find it very hard to believe that people are so ignorant or unable to get access to this information. I don't think that there's an excuse for you to be racist today or to claim that you're unknowledgeable. Go on Google, do basic information. I try to put it on as much as I can on the Sincerely Alana website. So if you're watching this video, please feel free to start there, and I hope you just jump into the rabbit hole and continue exploration into race relations and how you can play your part in becoming an ally. Some basic tactics that I believe everyone can do every single day in order to take anti-racist action and become more educated is: one, assume that racism is everywhere and occurs every single day. Because it does. It absolutely does. If you don't already assume this, then you need to start assuming it, and that leads me to step number 2, which is notice how racism is denied, minimized, and justified. 3, take a stand against injustice. If you haven't already, be sure to attend a protest. If you don't feel comfortable attending a protest, go online, donate to causes and organizations online. Do more research, read books, watch movies, watch documentaries. There are so many documentaries on Netflix right now, which I know everybody's on Netflix. We're all stuck in quarantine, so we're all watching Netflix, Hulu, Disney Plus, all these different streaming programs and companies, organizations, I don't know. But Netflix has a whole Black Lives Matter movement collection, and I just really encourage you guys to watch those videos. One of my favorite movies that I watched is Just Mercy, which is, I don't know if it's still streaming free, but I know it was for a while. And also 13th, which is a documentary on Netflix. 4th, and I think what is really important in order to correct the generational spread of racism, is talk to your children. talk to your children, talk to other young people that are around you and in your community about racism and how they can stop it. Be sure to suggest resources for them, also recommend movies if that's what they're interested in. I think it's really important to find outlets that that child is interested in, so that way the message sticks with them. And finally, you know, this goes back to research, but understand and learn from the history of whiteness and racism. I love history, but a lot of people say it, but I think they don't realize history is meant to be learned from in order to prevent the same mistakes from happening. So that's all for today's video. I hope you guys found it interesting and helpful. Quickly to review, we talked about white supremacy, white privilege, and white fragility, as well as how to take anti-racist action, how to become an ally. Remember, we all need to do our own work. This is not just for white people. These tips also apply to people of color who need to address their own racial bias. Take the time, do the work. It's not going to be easy. It's extremely, extremely hard. But this is something that we all need to do and practice in order to help the next generation thrive without living in such a damaging, racist, and scary environment. Please go to sincerelyalana.org for more resources and my recommendations on what to read, watch, and listen to for more anti-racist information. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Spread peace, love, and positivity. Mahalo.